Well, welcome. Outstanding. So, some of you I met last week. I have a terrible recollection of names in general, so please excuse my lapse in that direction. I might ask again. I would like to be helpful. And what I've given you is what I've learned since I was in my 20s. This is what I've learned in this handout. It involves integration, recognizing that the world we live in has international and interdisciplinary dimensions. However, to solve the problems that we face collectively requires blending of these different international and interdisciplinary dimensions. And the only solution I can think of is one of inclusive, because otherwise you're making subjective choices. So to be objective in the process, it has to be transparent and inclusive. So it's along those lines that I've been on this journey. And for those of you that I haven't met, I have had two functionally different careers. My first was as a principal investigator leading expeditions to Antarctica. And I led expeditions to Antarctica for 25 years and scuba dived under the ice throughout the year. Deepest dives ever made on Earth under ice by scuba. And now focus on science diplomacy on a global scale. And much of the origin of this came from being in the Antarctic and looking at this region of the Earth that has been effectively a zone of peace throughout the Cold War because of science. And that gave me insights about issues on a planetary scale. And if I were to reduce all of that thinking about the planetary scale, I would come up with a simple observation that there are regions that are defined under international law that relate to nations. And nations uniquely think in terms of national interests. The world, in terms of its operation, is based on groups of nations working together or, in unfortunate circumstances, in conflict. And so it is on this planetary scale that this Antarctic activity introduced the notion that the challenge we face fundamentally on a planetary scale is one of balancing national interests and common interests that we all share. And so how many of you are international relations focused? One, security focused. Some type of human activity other than military action. Okay. Military action? Okay, fine. So the challenge I've observed is one of balancing national interests and international interests, the common interests that we share as a civilization on a planetary scale. And for me, this has been a challenge. How do I, as an individual, just one person on a planet that will have 8 billion people by the end of this decade, and by the end of the century, there'll be 12 billion people on Earth. That's a more than 1,000% increase in global human population size in just the last 2 centuries. And for context, the oldest calendars on Earth are 6,000 years or 60 centuries. So in just the last 2 centuries, global human population size has increased over 1,000%. It has fundamentally changed the way nations operate on Earth, because we're now all interconnected. And nations operated historically by defining boundaries. And now we have something that's permeable on an entire planetary scale. We're observing it, with, for example, in the atmosphere with carbon dioxide as a discussion item. So what I'd like to talk about today, and the series here, this is a dialogue series, so it wasn't intended to be a seminar series. I'm not bringing anybody else in, it's just me. good, bad, whatever, for this series. And the objective is to introduce ideas that will enhance what you're currently doing, specifically in the context of decision making. So the things that you learn, the ideas that you generate, have value if they contribute to decision making. Different types of decisions. Decisions about governance mechanisms, decisions about built infrastructure, decisions that couple them to create sustainable solutions, but decisions. And so today's focus is on decision making, and I have a brief activity involved that I'll ask you to share with each other along the way. The goal is to think in terms of informed decisions, not just any flavor of decision, not an evidence-based decision, not a data-driven decision, but an informed decision. And the objective is sustainability. And sustainability in this context is on a planetary scale. So, as I was just mentioning, and this was shown last week, but it's compelling to just reinstate this in the discussion. The blue line is global human population size. And if you're contributing to informed decision making, that means you also have to navigate lots of decision makers, because everybody's in part of this process. So here's a discussion right now between a relationship between global human population size, 8 billion people by the end of this decade, 12 billion by the end of this century. This is empirical evidence. The orange line here is carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, historical and current. And just to be objective in this process, I took these data from the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So this trend is unchanged. It's not, no manipulation at all. If you were to talk about climate, for example, on a planetary scale, because climate operates on a planetary scale, in a politically charged environment, how do you do that in a way that enables you to discuss this without the politics, across adversaries and allies alike? How do you introduce a discussion about global human population, not independent of growth, but just the notion of global human population and global carbon dioxide without creating a political discussion? That's where the diplomacy, that's where science diplomacy has its utility. It is in building common interests among allies and adversaries alike. So on one hand, there is the orange line and then the blue line, but you can clearly see that they're related. And whether the orange line recognizes it or the blue line recognizes it, it's unambiguous. It's on the same order as the sky is blue. And so to diffuse the discussion between two groups that don't see eye to eye, that don't think in terms of common interests, you create a larger umbrella that both of those activities fit under. So regardless of whether the orange line is influencing the blue line or the blue line is influencing the orange line, there is clearly a symbiosis between the two. And so in thinking about the issue, it isn't a matter of this blue line is right or the orange line is right. They're both related. And that's the responsibility that we collectively have in terms of how we operate on a planetary scale. It's unambiguous. And just for context, a very similar discovery recently. In the Royal Society in London, they discovered that a letter that Galileo had written to the Vatican in the 1600s, early 1600s, because he had described that the Earth rotated around the sun. But according to the church at the time, the Earth was the center of the universe. And so at the time, that thinking made it very difficult to shine light on the simple fact, the reality, that the Earth rotated around the sun. It wasn't up for debate. It wasn't a matter of political distinction. It was a fact. And it created this dialogue. And as a consequence, Galileo was a heretic and excommunicated and so on. And this letter that had been hiding in the archive in the Royal Society for 250 years, lost. It had gone into legend, this letter. Was found recently by a postdoctoral scientist from Italy that was roaming through looking at scientists from Italy that were possibly associated with England at the time. And he found this letter. And it's remarkable because the similarities today. The idea that we don't live in a globally interconnected civilization is absolutely the same argument that the Earth is rotating. Hello, welcome. I have something for you to ponder. So, onward. The notion of sustainability is, I would say, a gift because we live in this interconnected world. It's interconnected at local scales to global scales. And I would say that our civilization has matured to the point where we can identify common interests, a list of common interests on a planetary scale. So we've actually matured during this period as well. There is a list here, and these items are agnostic in terms of scale. This applies to a village as well as to the world. So all of these goals that have been identified are a gift to humanity. And if you think about it, maybe there's 17 today, and maybe in 50 years it's 15 or 20. Whatever the idea is, that we have a basic list, a baseline list for issues that are relevant at global to local scales. And the issues involve dimensions that cross global to local, so clearly it involves international. And the solutions aren't just related to the welfare of the societies, it's also the environment, and so on and so forth, so it's interdisciplinary. And the challenge that is involved is that the notion of sustainability, the fundamental element of sustainability, is that it operates across generations. So sustainability isn't just the moment, it's operating across generations. And so one of the problems with the concept of sustainability that has existed since Gro Harlem Brundtland introduced it in the 1980s in the United Nations. And there's Our Common Future is a book that I encourage you to read. Looking into the future is something that governments can't really do because they're preoccupied with the present, all of the bushfires that they currently have to put out. So there are all of the urgencies that are defined. So those urgencies are characterized in terms of risks of political, economic, and cultural instabilities. So whatever those risks are, governments at local to global scales try and mitigate. Those risks are the basic fodder of security. Any type of security discussion, whether it's human security or climate security or food security or social security or environmental security, all of them deal with risks of political, economic, and cultural instability at one level or another. So the challenge of sustainability was that it projected into the future. And the future wasn't necessarily seen as urgent. However, on a planetary scale, the urgency is absolute. We have to figure out how to manage human activities of 12 billion people on Earth by the end of the 21st century. And it isn't realistic to go back to the discussions that happened in the 1960s and 1970s when global human population growth was discussed. It was on the order of solving it by population control. And that's inhumane, it's wrong, and it's inappropriate, just generally. So the notion of population control just won't work in a way that's planned. However, human population control also exists because of the apocalypse of war, famine, and disease. So there are also population controls that happen because of populations and the way they interact. So the urgency that exists in this is across generations. And that's part of the challenge. If you're thinking across generations, you have to be inclusive, because you're thinking about others' interests in ways that are beyond your own, if you're thinking across generations. So the challenge we face in terms of all of the sustainable development discussion at global to local levels is thinking about the intersection of international, interdisciplinary, and inclusive to solve specific problems, whatever they are, whatever you're impassioned to follow in terms of discussion. So it is in this context that science diplomacy, at least from my development of this, and recognizing that there are many different discussions, no more right than wrong, they're all helpful. For me, the construction has been to look at it as a puzzle. And as a puzzle, it's a process. And so part of the puzzle is to identify pieces and how you put them together. So one of the pieces, and a significant piece, was international, interdisciplinary, and inclusive. And I defined that piece as called holistic. So if you have a puzzle piece, the puzzle piece has shape to it. And I define holistic as international, interdisciplinary, and inclusive. So when I think of the word holistic, I'm specifically thinking about these three terms integrated together. So that's, and then recognizing that the world is dynamic. There is no such thing as a magical bullet that's somehow going to solve the problem once and forever. So the challenge in a dynamic system to create solutions, they involve processes. So I see science diplomacy as a process, as a holistic process. Now, that's all well and good, but what does this process do? How does it operate? How does it contribute in some meaningful way? It involves informed decision making, which is what we're going to talk about today. And the purpose is, just as we've been talking about in terms of the Earth, the purpose is to balance national interests and common interests on a global scale for the benefit of all on Earth. It's not just humans, all on Earth. That means we have responsibility for the ecosystems and for the atmosphere and for the land and everything else, animate and inanimate, on Earth, across generations. That's, for me, the most current rendering of how I see science diplomacy and its contribution. So my responsibility in this type of dialogue is to share with you insights and experiences that have enabled this process to operate. It actually is an operation. And I think I mentioned last week, if I didn't, I'll tell you, but I think I mentioned last week when I convened the NATO Advanced Research Workshop on Environmental Security in the Arctic Ocean. Did I mention that last week? I did. So this was the first formal dialogue between NATO and Russia regarding security in the Arctic. And the trick there was to identify a topic that neither party could introduce. So Russia clearly wanted to talk to NATO about the Arctic, and NATO clearly wanted to talk to Russia about the Arctic, but they couldn't figure out how to convene the dialogue. Hadn't done it. So the year before I convened this meeting, there was actually a large NATO activity in Iceland, and they had excluded Russia. 50% of the Arctic is Russia. So in a non-governmental position, it was easy for me to identify that 50% or thereabouts of the Arctic is Russian. So it's any discussions about the Arctic are incomplete without engaging Russia, just at a basic level. And I had no skin in the game. So that's part of the discussion in terms of navigating. So I was certainly at the mercy of large decision makers, many governments in the process. So for me, in the early formulation of these activities and thinking about how it was possible to convene, and this is where I want to impart whatever insights, skills that have enabled these types of things to happen, which happen regularly all the time, next week included, for example. So an early observation was that these discussions involved stakeholder perspectives. So again, consider stakeholder perspectives in terms of holistic. So you've got international, interdisciplinary, inclusive stakeholder perspectives. And then there's evidence, whatever the evidence is, but it also is holistic. It's international, interdisciplinary, inclusive. And then we've got governance mechanisms that range from local to global. And again, these are holistic. And so for me, these three areas really defined the nature of where decisions, the origin of decisions. What are the elements, the underlying ingredients that contribute to decisions in any case? Well, there are certain issues that are identified by stakeholders. There's certain information that is necessary to compel action. And there's certain institutional relationships that exist. And so all of these together swirl around. And the notion of diplomacy came out of this thinking. The notion of options came out as opposed to recommendations. So I observed, and I've had a number of discussions with people involved, but with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they got caught in a political discussion. They never intended to be involved in this political discussion at all. You know, got a group of scientists doing their best to interpret the dynamics of the Earth system, and they're embroiled in a political discussion about climate. And I wanted to understand and avoid that going forward. And so the observation was that these scientists had introduced a summary for policymakers. So they'd gone through from whatever their research background was, which was based on their activity, their collective activity, and then introduced a summary to the policymakers as if the policymaker doing that was going to influence a decision. And so as a consequence, that notion of influencing a decision, contributing a summary to policymakers for the purposes of policymaking, was seen as intrusive. And it was seen as oriented from an agenda, the agenda of the IPCC. And as a consequence, the IPCC and the international community have been at odds with this discussion about climate, which is unfortunate. Nonetheless, stakeholder perspectives and the evidence and the governance mechanisms. And so in terms of sustainability as a concept, and puzzle pieces have shape. And the shape that you have with the puzzle pieces are how you define them. And so if you imagine that this puzzle that we're creating, that we're going to work through, called our life, has pieces that you have to create, put together, and the challenge is as much to create the pieces as it is to put them together throughout your life in general. And so for the word sustainability, in terms of giving it definition, not just a word, and to be specific so that you can have a conversation with somebody who might have a different starting point. The objective is to build common interests. You have to define starting points, terms, in ways that are understood. It isn't necessarily that they're agreed, but they're understood. And so for me, the concept of sustainability has three underlying characteristics. One is the notion of stability. So something is sustainable, it in sense is involving balance. So the notion of balance is explicit in terms of balancing environmental protection, economic prosperity, and societal well-being. And then the question of resilience, the notion of tipping points and sudden changes and catastrophe, I think loses import in the sense that it's not hopeful. And I think the challenge in terms of responding to the future is to seek solutions that are hopeful and inspirational. So I would offer the word resilience as a source of continuity between the present and the future. That it is a system that has the capacity to respond to change. It is resilient. And the characteristics of that balance, for example, are environmental protection, economic prosperity, and societal well-being. But it also involves urgencies today and across generations. And so part of the challenge with sustainability was that it didn't have that urgency. into the future. So if you give it the urgency, then that in itself becomes a discussion item. National interests and common interests, certainly there's balance required there. And the basic feature of all of this, the notion of balancing national interests and common interests, ultimately rests on strategies to promote cooperation and prevent conflict. So the stability that's involved here is peace. The stability that underlies the ability to think about all of these other issues associated with society is possible when there's peace and stability. And so the two elements that are opposite sides of the same coin. One side is strategies to promote cooperation, and the other side are strategies to prevent conflict. Same coin, coin of peace. Two sides are appropriate, necessary. Most of the time, it's easier to focus on strategies to promote cooperation. It's often very difficult to talk about strategies to prevent conflict, because to talk about strategies to prevent conflict, you bring forces of conflict into the discussion. So, in a summary, in a sense, trying to think about informed decision making. We live in a globally interconnected civilization. There's no ambiguity about it. Certainly the concept of a world war in the 20th century, first time in 60 centuries of human calendar use, never happened before. We are a global interconnected civilization. The issue is that on one end of the spectrum, operating on a planetary scale, there are security timescales, these mitigating of risks of political, economic, societal, and environmental instability that are immediate. However, there are also urgencies that operate across sustainability timescales, dealing with the balance between societal, economic, environmental elements across generations. And these must be addressed by nations and peoples individually and collectively. So that's the gig, that's the challenge. And so I view this context of this continuum of urgencies from security timescales to sustainability timescales, this continuum of urgency that by definition, in terms of a proposition, that informed decisions operate across a continuum of urgencies. So on a planetary scale, the continuum of urgencies ranges from security timescales to sustainability timescales. That's on a planetary scale. So an informed decision dealing with planetary issues means that we're dealing with issues that are operating across security timescales as well as sustainability timescales. Not one end or the other, but simultaneously. That's an informed decision, and it operates across this continuum of urgencies. So that's a planetary scale. If we take it down to a local scale, to you as an individual, if you're driving down the road in your car, you're driving down, the road has its own conditions, these conditions may change, that's just the environmental surroundings. You've got to be aware of the cars around you, how they're moving in relation to your car. So there's a lot of three-dimensional activity when you're driving down the road. At the same time, to drive safely, you have to be aware of the traffic ahead of you. The lights start going on, you have to begin to think about where you're going to brake or maneuver or so on and so forth. And you've got to be looking in your mirror to be thinking about what's coming up from behind you. And so you've got this continuum of urgencies that you're responding to in your car, as an example, as an analogy. And so in a sense, that suggests if you as an individual to the world on a planetary scale, that the continuum of urgencies is in some way proportional to the spatial dimension of the circumstance. So in the case of you driving down the road in a car, the car is relatively small, you're looking at the traffic before and not behind you, that defines your continuum of urgencies. We look on a planetary scale, it's across security to sustainability timescales. So what I'd like you to do now, you've got two end members. So I'd like you to pair up, and I'd like you to talk to each other for about 5 minutes and identify two issues, impacts, or resources, and describe the continuum of urgencies associated with those issues, impacts, or resources. Okay? Yeah. Questions?
Can you give an example?
So the example is the car. So the continuum of urgencies is from the traffic in front to the traffic behind, for example. So I'd like you to think together, pair up, and talk about two continuums of urgency, and we will share. Please. It could be anything.
Yeah.
Just
Be
be-
like more abstract, like
It could be a bicycle ride. It could be a hike up a mountain. It could be a trip, yeah, or it could be a trip to Europe or whatever.
Yeah, just to use how you.
What are you studying?
I mean, I would say about the cyber revolution.
Okay, so you've got global scale issue, for example. Okay. Did this exercise bear fruit? Did you identify a problem, issue, impact, or resource, and think about its continuum of urgencies? Okay, please share.
So Katya had the idea of dealing with disaster resilience.
Okay.
So your security timescale is, well, actually the sustainability timescale would be making adaptations to a city plan or a building to make it resilient to earthquakes or floods, but that requires long-term investments.
Okay.
Whereas your security timescale is balancing the political and economic short-term needs of the society.
Okay.
So maybe building a highway or making some other investment that's more short-term focused.
Okay. Any others? How about teak?
Yeah, there's a huge deforestation problem in Burma, and they're losing acres of teak forest by the day. And so they can obviously replant them, but they're never going to get these size teak forests for hundreds of years.
So there's a specific time frame. How about here?
We talked about cyber threats
Okay.
and how they evolve. So we need past experience and previous experience as well in order to build upon this and update it. Let's say the measures that you can counter these threats. Cyber threats that get distributed on a global scale. And talk about like the preparation, the identification of the problem to address it. So we need to identify, to prepare first in the first place, and to identify them, and then to respond to the threat.
Are the responses on global?
It's a respond on a global scale, perhaps, because some cyber threat might definitely involve more than one country, so it affects many countries. And like there were malicious codes in the past, like WannaCry that affected a lot of countries, the UK, the health system, and the UK, for example. So we need more collective approach, let's say, to this kind of threats.
So what does the solution look like?
A solution could be a cooperation among the cyber crime agencies across the globe, and build. Like for example, Europol has the EC3, the Cybercrime Center, and FBI has a similar center that they build and enhance the advanced knowledge.
Don't you think these organizations are already cooperating
Cooperating, of course.
and competing?
committee. Yeah, I would say that in order to address, there is a need of cooperation.
Right, but these are nations,
Yeah,
so nations compete.
yeah, I would say so as well.
So if we know that nations compete, then how do you create a solution?
Find common interests.
Okay, and where are the common interests? Who would you bring into that common interests?
Who? Of the nations?
No, well, who? Just in a general sense. So if you assume that the answer rests with nations, then the only entities that are institutions that are interacting are nations, and there are various agencies. So if you assume that nations are the answer to the problem, then the nations are the ones that are involved. My question is, are there others that are involved in the solutions?
Sure.
Who?
There's organizations that aren't governmental.
Okay.
There's also citizen populations that have access to these types of things as well that can popular opinion?
So imagine you have a risk that is pervasive, and cyber is a good example. It happens with any type of innovation. It really does. We had nuclear, and had possibilities of nuclear energy, and we got nuclear weapons. And I remember reading a report by Dean Rusk that was written in the 1960s, and they were talking about controlling weather as a weapon, basically. So imagine all the work goes into studying the climate. We understand the resolution, the computers on Earth have the resolution to actually understand the climate. Then you have the ability to effectively influence the climate at different scales that are directed by those sources that have those insights. So potentially, something as benign as studying the climate could be a weapon, for example, because it would be associated with weather. So these are all of these things. We have the internet, and which is a great tool. We use it to communicate, put my little thingamajigger in the computer, and suddenly I've got slides and we can talk and have a good conversation, but it all goes through some type of ether out there. And that ether has all kinds of risks associated with it. Now we're talking about cyber threats. So all kinds of things. We got healthcare, brilliant drugs and vaccines, and those things could be used or abused just as well. All these things exist. And we live in a world where this is all happening simultaneously. And governments have to respond. They have to respond to the best of their ability. First off, governments, nations will think after national interests. That's first and foremost. They will always think of national interests. Sometimes in alliance and sometimes with adversaries. Challenge. So these are global problems that have to be solved. And there isn't a simple answer. But the clarity is that it's not just the nations themselves that are involved in the solution. The notion of common interests is that we all are part of the process. We all have responsibility in this. We're all impacted by the outcomes of decisions. Our individual and collective responsibility is to participate, in a sense, to do the best we can to contribute to informed decision making. And so the idea, in a sense, is that it's from this level of responsibility that you tease out these questions. And the questions, in this sense, relating to cyber, if nations themselves are the source of solution, then the solution is necessarily going to be incomplete, because nations exclude lots of everything that isn't national. So it's part of the challenge. And I would argue that as individuals associated with institutions like specifically universities that sit in this very privileged place that's in between businesses and in between NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and in between governments, that doesn't have the agendas of a business per se, doesn't have the agendas of an NGO per se, and doesn't have the agendas of a government per se, because universities are intended to be inclusive. Like libraries, they're public goods in a sense. And so it's in that mix that we, as individuals, not as governments, not as diplomats given authority by governments, but as individuals, can act in diplomatic ways that contribute to the welfare of the world we live in. And the insight that seems to be roaming around with increasing alacrity is that there is such a thing as an informed decision. And the identifying what an informed decision is and how it operates actually allows for that process associated with informed decision making to improve, to be trained, to enhance. So the worksheet that you have on the opposite side of this is part of the assignment, per se. I recognize this isn't a class and this isn't intended to take your time, but it is something that you can think about. And I did ask you each to ponder. And so it was in that spirit that I provide this to you. And it's something I ponder all the time. So, it's not something that goes away. And what I would ask you to think about for your own use, each of you in some way is doing a capstone, correct? I want to enhance your capstone. Whatever it is, whatever direction it is, I want to enhance it. And I want to enhance it because I want you to be able to not only focus on what you're doing, but to think of its implications and to think in ways that can be applied in terms of contributing to informed decision making. And there are elements in this mix of this matrix, this international, the interdisciplinary, the inclusive, that reveal to you the types of things, questions that you can ask that will enhance your research. It may not be all of them, may only be one of them, but those questions of the relevance of a tool that allows you to navigate between allies and adversaries alike, using science in that role, is something that you can all apply. And so it's along those lines that it's now important to define what I mean by science. So I've given you some discussion about notions of diplomacy and how to think about interacting between the blue line and the orange line. Now the challenge is to actually begin to put the pieces of the puzzle together. So we had the notion of options before, introduced in terms of the interaction of stakeholders and holistic evidence and governance mechanisms. And we had the notion of evidence before, holistic evidence. And so what I'd like to suggest is the term science is itself holistic, that it is international, it is interdisciplinary, and it is inclusive. The context of science has those dimensions of that puzzle piece. And to be inclusive means that we have on one side natural sciences, things that have hypotheses and experiments and controls and so on, where you seek to be objective. On the other hand, you have social sciences, where the metrics may be associated with values and ethics, as well as socioeconomics and other elements that can be quantified directly. But social sciences has completely different methodologies than the natural sciences. And so the two are often seen on other sides, but they both have this notion of sciences associated with it. In Russia, for example, law is openly considered to be a science. It's not an art, it's a science. So, for example. And then we have indigenous knowledge. It has completely different methodologies. These methodologies may be associated with cultures and histories. In each case, natural sciences, social sciences, and indigenous knowledge, they reveal patterns and trends. And those patterns and trends become the basis for decisions. And so, one way of looking at all of these together, again, is to create a larger umbrella. If you're talking about human population size and global climate or atmospheric carbon dioxide, you can think of it in terms of a larger umbrella. The same sense is to think of this in terms of a larger umbrella. And for the term science, one umbrella that fits the natural sciences, the social sciences, and indigenous knowledge is the concept of science as a study of change. So if I were to say science is the study of change, if I were to characterize science as a study of change, is there anybody in this room that does not feel included? That's the challenge. If you want to build common interests, people have to feel included. So the notion of building common interests is explicit. And the observation is that it's not something you can introduce at a specific point. So the case of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they introduced options at this stage to inform decisions. And they missed all these levels below that in which the decision makers weren't involved. They didn't inform the decision makers about the evidence or the data or the methods or the questions necessarily. They introduced them at the stage of options. And so the engagement didn't begin until here. And so in thinking about a process, a skill, a methodology that you can use, that you can apply, not just theory behind it, but something that you can actually use, the stage of questions is the easiest, least cumbersome, least problematic stage to engage dialogue. And the purpose in what we're having is a dialogue. So basically, all I'm doing is introducing questions, constantly introducing questions. I hope that you think about the questions, but that's what we're doing together. We're at the question stage. If we had a purpose, in a sense, if there was something that we were wanting to solve, and we had questions of common concern among us as an interdisciplinary, international, and inclusive group, if we had questions of common concern, it would raise the question of what are the methods that we use to answer that? Those methods would certainly come from the natural sciences and the social sciences and perhaps indigenous knowledge. I mean, indigenous knowledge does give us something very special in that they operate across 7 generations. So the cultures of indigenous peoples operate across generations. And so we have yet to figure that out on a planetary scale. Indigenous peoples already know that and culturally understand that, for example. When we've identified these methods of common concern to answer the questions, we generate data. Data is an interesting thing. Data isn't just something that sits on a table. Data is plucked from different sources and assembled in a manner specifically to answer a question. So whatever the question is, you formulate the data to answer that question with those methods. The observation is that data is specific to answering questions, based on a specifically defined set of methods. Evidence, however, is for decisions. So evidence for decisions is different than data to answer questions. And so there is a difference between data and evidence. And part of the public dialogue about this right now is confusion. That data and evidence are the same thing. They're not. Data and evidence are fundamentally different. Data is designed to answer questions. Evidence is for decisions. So the question then is, how do data and evidence differ? And the difference is that evidence is for a decision, which means that you understand the institution that will be making a decision. So in order for a decision to be made, evidence for a decision, it must involve a decision-making institution. The institution may be a government agency at local to global scales. It may be a business, but it involves an institution that's making a decision. So if you're providing evidence, it's specifically for an institution. So a component of evidence that's different than data is it's integrated with the decision-making process in some way. So you know where the evidence sits in terms of the decision-making process. And you know who, if you're doing your homework properly, you know who to introduce the evidence to so that you can move through the system in a practical way. And so if you're thinking about solutions, practical solutions, you find out who the institutions are that are making decisions. and you find out who the decision makers are in those institutions, and then you have the ability to contact individuals specific to specific solutions. However, the evidence is only sufficient to compel the decision makers to act. The evidence itself isn't sufficient to tell the decision makers what to do, where to build, how to invest, what the elements of this, what they're constructing. And that's where options come in. So options are different than evidence. Options are specific solutions to a problem that was originating with questions that were built based on common interests. And the options at this point, from the perspective of an individual that is not a decision maker. So I have never been a decision maker in this context and probably will never be one. In this context, my role is simply to contribute to informed decision making. So how do I do that? How do I, as an individual that's not part of a decision making institution, contribute to an informed decision without creating a political response? So that means I have to come into this discussion in a way that's not seen as intrusive. How do I, just little old me, come into a discussion with decision makers that may be presidents, they may be foreign ministers, it might be all of NATO and the Maritime Command, for example. How do I, as an individual, contribute in a meaningful way, in a helpful way to that audience without being intrusive because I'm not a decision maker? What do I do? How do I do that?
The means that you use.
Yeah, I mean, how would you do that? How would you get in front of, so a specific instance. So I was invited after this NATO workshop at one point to speak to both the Norwegian Parliament, one set of meetings, and to the entire NATO Maritime Command. The NATO Maritime Command was in Whitehall in London, and we were in a building, and they had two long sets of tables. 50 admirals on one side of the tables and 50 admirals on the other side of the tables, and the Supreme Allied Commander at the head of the table, and all of the various staff. And these were admirals, and with all their gold braids and epaulets and blue suits and white suits and so on and so forth. It's a sea of blue, really. It was amazing. How do I, as an individual, contribute to a discussion like that? How do you introduce something into that audience in a way that that audience can find helpful?
You present them with evidence of your findings and let them come up with the options.
No, I'm coming in with options.
So why would you come with options if you wanted to have them? If you want to include them in the decision-making process.
I'm not including them in they are the decision makers. I have nothing to do with how that operates.
So wouldn't you be operating on the same way that the IPCC was doing their?
How do I avoid that mistake? That's the question.
Yeah,
Exactly.
no,
How do I
there's
avoid?
options.
No.
Okay.
The IPCC presented a summary of recommendations. So they were starting at this point in the process, as I mentioned earlier. So they're starting up here, and they're introducing us to the governments. So they already missed out all the common building stages down here.
I read I'm taking the climate change class, and we read the 2014 report, and they present. All these scientists are part of. They're attached to national universities and research groups. So I don't really understand why you think that they were presented. I mean, there's a lot of data in the.
So if you read the IPCC report, there's a section specifically for policymakers
Yes.
at the very beginning
Yeah.
that pulled out as a specific section.
Yeah.
So they were making recommendations to
But
policymakers.
they were also presented the data and the evidence.
No, that's true. So and you identified the question correctly. The IPCC got into a mess because they introduced this to the policymakers, the decision makers, in a way that created a political dialogue. How can you avoid that?
You present it at the end? I don't know. You
So-
present the data and the evidence, and then you make recommendations.
Is it just that they're presenting evidence to go forward, and so if you start actually asking these questions and having them engage in questions, they're more, you're including them in more of the process of kind of reaching conclusions about, okay, or making them more receptive to evidence as well.
So, I mean, there's a group of admirals guys that sits in, each of these guys has, you know, billions of dollars of assets. NATO controls hundreds of billions of dollars of assets. And, you know, there's three elements of NATO, the army, the air, the land, and the sea. And this was the sea part of it. So these guys, there's no inclusion per se. I mean, they're making decisions all the time. So it's presumptuous of me to think in terms of me being included with them. That ridiculous. I mean, I have no power base. I have no position. How can I introduce options into that group in ways that they would find helpful? This is the diplomacy behind it. So I've introduced what science is. Science is the study of change. So IPCC and a group of knowledgeable scientists identified all kinds of data that they took as evidence. Okay, so they confused data and evidence. That was the first issue. Data was designed to ask a specific set of science questions. The data was not the evidence in terms of the decision-making processes. They were trying to influence a decision-making process with regard to agreements. Options, for example, how do I introduce options into a group where I'm not part of that decision-making environment? This is where the diplomacy comes from. I mean, this is a school of law and diplomacy. Fundamentally, what are the elements of diplomacy? Fundamental element of diplomacy.
To present a strong argument for them?
But that's a negotiation. So, you know, we have a negotiation, I present a strong argument. How do you act as a diplomat? Yes, please.
I was gonna say, why don't you present options in a way that they can relate to, though, like something that pertains to them, so it doesn't seem like it's so. So if you're a person that's not connected to this group and you come into this group with options, I feel like you need to make it something that they can understand. I feel like it translates to their world and to like what their missions are.
Correct. So, I mean, that you have to be in tune enough with the questions that they're asking to contribute. So I had an advantage. One advantage is I was invited. Nonetheless, in that invited environment, how do I contribute something that would be helpful to this group without engendering a political response, recognizing that there were 40 nations, heads of 40 navies in this audience, and all of their senior staff that ran the military in these countries.
You need to present an option that is going to be of common interest, that will concern the majority at least.
So that's true. I mean, you can try and imagine what a common interest is, and I would gather that you would probably be incomplete in identifying something that was uniformly accepted. So the diplomacy isn't specific to the solution. Diplomacy is a skill. So if you're in an environment where you're introducing something that is intended to be helpful, how do you do that in a way where it is well received without encumbering and engendering a political response? So avoiding the pitfalls that the IPCC got involved with, and at the same time creating a solution that is seen as helpful.
Make it seem like their idea.
Okay, but then you're playing psychologist in the group, and you know these are powerful people. They're not going to be psychoanalyzed and so on and so forth. They'll walk right all over you. So this is not going to happen. So how do you introduce something into that type of environment? Practical. Imagine at some point in your careers, something like this happens. How do you respond to that? So, as a teacher here, and I like teaching, I really do like teaching, but as a teacher, I want you to go away and I want you to be effective in what you do. And part of it is involving you in understanding skills. So how do you respond in that type of audience where you're introducing options to decision makers? Think about the concept of an option as being different than a recommendation. That a recommendation involves an agenda, a recommendation involves a position of advocacy, and whenever you have agendas and advocacy, you've got a political dynamic. So how do you avoid advocacy? How do you avoid the appearance even of an agenda? An agenda is what creates advocacy, and it also creates a political dynamic. So how do you avoid the appearance of an agenda?
Drawing examples from past experience.
Perhaps. So the past is a safe place in the sense that it doesn't involve a current decision. So it's a place where decisions have already been made. And then, you get down to an analysis of that. That's where academic activities are. Academic activities are analyses. You're in a position of actually introducing an option, something that can be used. Or, what's the alternative used? Not used. So, if I'm, in this instance, and I treat you as decision makers, okay? So, my proposition to you as decision makers is that there is this concept of an informed decision. My proposition to you as the decision makers, and you will each make a decision that's rubbish or it's useful. That's your decision, your choice. And there's a methodology to go through that to reach informed decisions. You're the decision makers. I respect that. I respect that I'm not the decision maker. I'm not in your position to make a decision for you. You'll make your own decision. So it's inappropriate for me to try and insert something into your decision. I'm trying to introduce options, and I'm being explicit in this instance, respecting you as the decision makers. These options can be used or they can be ignored. Explicitly. Anything I tell you here can be used or ignored explicitly. If I say that in those terms, there is no ambiguity at all about any agenda. I am respecting you as the decision maker, and I'm trying to be helpful, because what I'm trying to do is introduce options that you as a decision maker can use or ignore so that you make an informed decision. And so the process here isn't a right decision or a wrong decision, a good decision or a bad decision. It's an informed decision. And so imagine all of us, in all of the things that we do, and all the insights that we have, being able to contribute in meaningful ways to informed decisions. The only way that will happen is if all of us have some mechanism of channeling ideas. And if we're all a loud chorus and just this cacophony of sound coming at the decision makers, they close the doors.
So the main idea behind this is when you're presenting options, you need to have find the best alternative option.
So you may have a preferred option. That's perfectly reasonable. It's the diplomacy behind it is how it's introduced. It's not so much what the option is as to how it's introduced. So, yes, please.
I'm just finding it difficult to understand how to seem unbiased and not have an agenda. Let's say that you're introducing, climate change options, and you say you can ignore this option, or you can take, you can ignore the fact that if you keep burning fossil fuels, sea levels are going to rise 2 or 3 feet, or you can make a decision and avoid that. How can you, if you've already gone through the research and the data analysis, and you've gathered the evidence, how can you detach yourself from
So
the option of acting?
So you've identified the element of sea level rise and warming, for example, ice sheet melting. The considerations that a decision maker has to have is who's living along the coast, the property values, the impact of any relocation on communities, the risks of damage to those communities, and so on. So it's not just one dimension, it's many dimensions. And so if you're integrating in a holistic manner, in an international, interdisciplinary, and inclusive manner, then you will recognize it's not just one thing. It's not just the fact that the earth is warming and that we have to control fossil fuels. We have to control cutting down of forests. We've got to think about asphalt that isn't absorbing all the heat from space. We've got to think about the methane being produced from the Arctic. Lots of elements that are involved in this. It's not one dimension. And so if you come in with the idea that you've got the answer, you've already come in with a specific agenda. The idea is to be helpful. And to be helpful, you have to think, you have to struggle as best you can with this notion of balance, this integration of international, interdisciplinary, inclusive across those questions on the back. They're all relevant. Each one of those questions is relevant to the issues of climate change. For example, if you've worked your way through that list comprehensively, then you're in a position to think about what the umbrellas are that would be helpful in a discussion like that. So for me, in a discussion like talking to a group of NATO countries, aligned countries, Russia wasn't in this room. My comment was 50% of the Arctic is Russia. Any discussions about the Arctic are incomplete without Russia. At that level, at the level of cooperation and conflict between the United States and Russia, which have the longest maritime boundary in the world. The two nations, Russia and the United States, have the longest maritime boundary between the Chukchi Sea in the Arctic going through the Bering Strait into the Bering Sea. The longest maritime boundary. At one point, the US and Russia are 2 miles apart. 50% of the Arctic is Russia. And to have a discussion without Russia is incomplete. So, in a sense, there's another element to insert an idea that isn't possible for these countries to interject themselves. So nobody in that room, in terms of NATO, is going to talk for the benefit of Russia at all. They're not going to introduce the concept that 50% of the Arctic is Russian and think about it and dwell on that issue in terms of promoting cooperation and preventing conflict, for example. So the other skill that's involved with this is when you're in a room with powerful people and you want to introduce something that's intended to be helpful, you have to be brave. You do have to be brave. You have to say things that you can imagine they can't say to themselves. And you have to recognize you're in a very vulnerable position because you don't have a position of influence. You're not one of the decision makers. But if the intention is to be helpful, that intention is recognized. And it's recognized because the statement of you can use or ignore this option is introduced. Clearly, I'm not trying to influence you, I'm trying to help you. Arik.
It's a little bit different from the way that policy memos, for instance, are taught. Even at Fletcher, but they're taught in such a way because that's how they're done within government. Right? In government, you write a policy memo that has background, description of the problem, the options, and then you give a recommendation. And I think in some sense, this process involves the options all being on the table, but ultimately it is up to the decision makers, to choose the option that they think is right. So it's I think option without recommendation.
Without advocacy. So when I write the word option, I put in parentheses next to it without advocacy. Because, in a sense, nobody wants to be aligned with somebody that's advocating something anyway. I mean, if I'm advocating something, in some way interferes with your position, you don't want to align with me. So being specific that options are without advocacy is actually helpful in terms of creating partnerships for example. And at the end of the day, partnerships are where common interests come from. And so these tools, in the case of Russia, which has been, and this is activities is sponsored by the Russia Eurasia program, but my journey with Russia for the last more than decade now has been very close and cooperative, and we've talked openly about issues of conflict and you know, at various levels. And so the only way that I can think that trying to be helpful to you as students, as decision makers, you know, in terms of your own course of action, those lessons, the options were introduced without advocacy, which meant I can be inclusive as well. I can be international, I can be interdisciplinary and inclusive because I'm being transparent. These options don't come with an agenda. These options are introduced simply with the idea of being helpful. That doesn't mean that I don't have a preferred option, or I might not think that the solution might be in this one direction, but I fully respect you as the decision maker. There's nothing I can do, really, one way or the other, to change that. You're always going to be the decision maker. No matter how much I jump up and down, yell or scream, your ideas are your own, for example. And so are the other decision makers. They're given that responsibility. At the end of the day, they make the decision. That only them. They make the decision. So it's respectful. And a significant feature of diplomacy is being respectful. So and when I teach, for example, ever since I was young, and I started teaching at UCLA when I was 23, I've always written questions next to the things, any comments I would write on the students' papers. And the reason is because I don't want to assume I have the answer, even though I might have taught something itself, and even though there might be a regurgitation of something I mentioned. I still don't want to assume I have the answer. So I've always written questions next to any of my comments. And it is simply out of respect to the student, that I don't want to assume I have all the answers. I want you to think in terms of questions. And so I write questions. And I think at the end of the day, in terms of real contributions that you will make, in terms of your activities, it's at this level. If you can participate at the framing of the questions, then potentially you can influence the entire process to inform decisions. And so the gift, and there are a number of opportunities at the Fletcher School which are really very good, where the students convene dialogues. The purpose of the dialogues among allies and adversaries alike is to identify questions of common concern. So if you can imagine the types of dialogues and you have juxtaposed different perspectives, stakeholder perspectives, in an inclusive way, then you can actually frame this entire process that would lead to informed decisions. Now maybe it goes back and forth across questions and data for a while, and maybe it gets lost in data to evidence a while, but it begins to go up, and eventually you see a path. And the path that we're talking about, your careers, isn't something that's going to happen today or next week. This is a lifetime. So in terms of the continuum of urgencies, in terms of your specific person, it's your lifetime. That's the continuum of urgencies. If you can see beyond your lifetime, if you can look into the future, then you're making significant contributions. But certainly the continuum of urgencies across your lifetime. And thinking about a process that allows you to traverse where you are today as you grow and as you mature and as you have different capacity, thinking about a process that allows you to contribute with increasing capacity through your life is really part of this training that you're here for. You want to go away with these skills and these methods and these insights in ways that you can contribute. And I'm suggesting in this process for you as the decision makers, as an option to use or ignore, that the apex goal at global to local levels, that the apex goal is an informed decision. It's not an evidence-based decision. It's not a data-driven decision. that the apex goal at global to local levels is an informed decision. And the context of where this fits in terms of the operation of our world is with the Sustainable Development Goals themselves. That these Sustainable Development Goals give us capacity to reach across global to local scales. So I suppose, just in terms of summary, and I'll probably use this slide again just because it's got the Fletcher colors and Tufts colors and nicely constructed. This light in the background was taken by a Veracross filter with a Pentax camera in 1981. And this right back here is the Commonwealth Glacier. It's a little dark. And these are our camps right here. You can see these tents right here. We're on the summer in New Harbor, which is in the southern part of the Ross Sea in a place called McMurdo Sound. And that was the first summer I was there. And then I spent the following year in Antarctica at this site. So one of the things that is interesting, just in terms of concepts, I mentioned that science can be considered as the study of change. And the symbol for change, the Greek letter, is delta, which is a triangle. So if you think about a triangle, what it is, and trying to think in terms of capacity and synergies. So if we think about the triangle has, it has international elements, interdisciplinary and inclusive. And arguably this context of holistic is represented by the triangle in a complete way, because inclusion is not limited to anything that conceptually that isn't represented here. If we think about the triangle itself, the triangle has three sides. The first three prime numbers are 1, 2, and 3. Each of these prime numbers cannot be divided by anything except itself. And the next one is 5, and so on and so forth. So prime numbers are represented by the concept of a triangle. How many of you have heard the term synergy? So synergy was a concept that was, I believe, introduced by Buckminster Fuller when he was building his geodesic domes, which were fitted triangles. So there are buckets of three features. I'm sure some of you can see it in religious context immediately, for example. So in terms of science diplomacy, and in terms of what this activity is, this dialogue. So we're at the stage of building questions down here, the dialogue phase, but in terms of science diplomacy and the Science Diplomacy Center, there are elements, and these elements are intertwined. You're involved in an education environment, so you listen to people like me tell you things, and you interact with yourselves, and you're participating in various activities in an educational environment. Your concept of your capstone is a research question. Some question that you're going to frame, you're going to do research about with a method that you've identified and that you're presumably or hopefully are passionate about. What I'm trying to introduce here is this notion of leadership. And that the leadership essentially comes from taking your education and your research and blending it in such a way that it has a value in terms of decisions. Decisions relate to actions. The actions can be associated with governance mechanisms, policies, regulatory devices, including insurance, agreements, and so on. They can relate to built infrastructure, mobile and fixed assets, communication systems, research systems, information systems, things that all require technology and capitalization. And if you think about sustainable development, you have to blend the governance mechanisms and the built infrastructure. So if in the case of, a good example is in the Arctic, they have two agreements, one's on search and rescue and one's on pollution preparedness and response. They're perfectly good agreements, but they're completely hollow because they don't have the ports or the ships or the helicopters or other assets that are needed to implement them. So the observation there is that in order for sustainable solutions to emerge, they require a coupling between the built and the governance mechanisms. And those are where suggestions and options can be introduced. That's where leadership can come from. In every one of your activities that you're doing for your research as part of your capstones. So what I've given you to ponder here as a concept, what I'd like to try and do is, have this useful to you in a way that in some way enriches your capstone. And what I'd like to do is, after next week, we will talk about an example, the Arctic in specific. And the last session, what I'd like you to do is to share how your research can be enhanced by answering one or more of these questions in terms of its international, interdisciplinary, and inclusive dimensions. And so something that you're not thinking about in terms of your research that in some way would contribute to informed decision making, to think about and to address. And as I mentioned last week, this discussion is intended to be open and engaged, and if there are others that you would like to have in this, I welcome you to welcome them. But the intention is here to be helpful and to introduce ideas that come from experience as a practitioner in terms of being able to participate in these discussions without the approval, without the authority to contribute in ways that are helpful. Questions? No questions? Please.
So I'm Native American. I'm from the Tuscarora Nation, and I was really interested how indigenous knowledge is implemented into these. From my background growing up on the reservation, it seems like it's not taken so seriously, as opposed to something from a scientific background or data gleaned from that route. So I was just curious, how is indigenous knowledge perceived, I guess, if it's implemented into your questions and then data.
So the process is one of thinking about what informed decisions might look like. So imagination across all these various steps. And if we're talking on a planetary scale, the questions relate to our basic survival on a planetary scale, then the solutions include all of these various dimensions. And one of the features of indigenous that I think is very special is that indigenous cultures, not one or in a specific area, but many around the world, think in terms of intergenerational, the notion of 7 generations. So that's your grandmother, your parents, yourself, your children, your grandchildren, and their children, for example. So 7 generations. So the notion of sustainability has a fundamental feature of generations. It's explicit. So when you, for example, in fisheries, the notion of maximum sustainable yield is measuring the recruitment of a population across generations. And so the fishery models look at fish populations across generations. When the notion of sustainable development emerged in the United Nations, it was specifically intergenerational. So the notion of the challenge of operating across generations is explicit. If we think about things like the Sustainable Development Goals, they have an arbitrary time frame of 2030. So you could say 2100 is an arbitrary time frame. So how do you look into the future in a way that isn't arbitrary? And the looking into the future in a way that isn't arbitrary but is into the future is across generations. And so if you in thinking about dialogues, how do you communicate with people in ways that resonate with them as an individual when you look them in the eye and you talk to them and you suddenly sparkle because you have some common interest? Thinking about generations is something that people can touch. And the basic observation there is that the children born today, when you have children, you have a child.
Yeah.
How old?
She's 2.
Your child will be alive in the 22nd century. For you, as a parent, your child alive in the 22nd century, and for your parents, that child's grandparents, your legacy, your personal legacy, is across the 21st century. Yourself, in terms of your child and your legacy. That's an epiphany that can be introduced around the world in terms of creating common interest, because everybody that has children and grandchildren can see the future of those individuals as part of themselves. And this is the challenge we face, is one of thinking about the world we live in today, which is caught up faster and faster with information in terms of the internet and social media and so on, more information. But recognizing there are challenges that are directly associated with our personal legacy on a planetary scale. Each of us has children, if we're fortunate, and goes grandchildren. So the notion of generations is best understood, I think, in indigenous cultures. Of any segment of the world, if you were to look at populations, I would say, just from thinking through life, that the indigenous peoples have the best understanding of the notion of generations, culturally embedded into their histories, and the notion of verbal and how to translate those cultures. The notion of generations, I think, is fundamental to how we proceed as a civilization. So I see that as part of this dialogue. I also see, in a practical sense, that there's a lot of inequity in the world. And part of it is empowering people to participate in the decision-making process. And it's not because you're given the decision-making capacity. What I'm introducing here is the opportunity to contribute to decisions, informed decisions, without being given the authority to do that. So normally the systems would operate, they would call up the information, like NATO would say, here's a set of questions, we'll figure it out, we'll have our meetings, we'll operate, for example. It is possible to insert into these processes notions that are bigger and more far-reaching. And the challenge we face today is on a planetary scale. It is fundamentally on a planetary scale. So if you take really odd bedfellows, for example, science and religion, I would argue, and do, that science and religion have a very fundamental common interest. So again, thinking about what the broader umbrella is. The common interest between science and religion is survival. And it's at that scale where our challenges are. And so that's indigenous. I see it as a very important piece, and that's the reason I put it in the center. Other questions? It's the hardest thing. I used to, when I was in college at the University of California, Santa Barbara. The hardest thing is to ask questions. So I welcome any flavor of questions. Which involve 15